Welcome, everyone, to this session on Shaping the Decade Ahead, Interconnections of Attention and Humanitarian Principles. My name is Annie Slemrod. I am Middle East editor at the New Humanitarian, a nonprofit newsroom that reports on humanitarian crises and aid policy. Before we get started, I am supposed to encourage participants to comment on Twitter using the hashtag, X, HCBerlin. I'm going to do that right now, so then you'll see it. You are welcome to comment if you're on Zoom and post questions there. There are also live captioning, accessibility features, and live translation into French and Spanish. And hopefully we will have plenty of time for questions. So if you can hold them for the last, let's say, 15 minutes. And if you don't have any questions, then we'll just keep talking to each other. First, I'm going to quickly introduce our esteemed speakers. Nikolaus Blome, a journalist, commentator, author, and currently director of RTL and NTV. Dr. Fiona Terry, head of the Center for Operational Research and Experience at the ICRC, and Professor Michael Eze, lecturer at California State University, who has written quite a bit on how we might look at humanitarianism through the lens of the African philosophical concept of Ubuntu. I am going to keep my words short because I think these panelists have a lot to say. But I will just say that, start off by saying I report on the Middle East, and on Saturday I took Twitter, or X, off my phone. I will admit that it was temporary, I just tweeted, but the pictures and videos and opinions that were being spread in the name of awareness, frankly started to seem like a place for spreading unverified information, maybe disinformation, and a lot of toxic takes on what is turning out and is unfolding as we speak to be a massive catastrophe. This panel is supposed to be about the future of the humanitarian system or humanitarianism itself in the face of limited public attention and changing opinions about what's worth the time and money of governments. But as a journalist who's actually increasingly stepping back from breaking news and looking at different ways to tell stories in ways that try to look at root causes and include the participation of people in places impacted by these crises, I'm personally starting to wonder if the search for 24/7 awareness is elusive and maybe not necessarily a net positive. I know it's controversial to sit here and say this, but if you'll allow me to play devil's advocate to start off with, I think that humanitarians are trying to compete for attention in their own particular patch and often failing. An international state-based system that relies on attention and funding from governments who can hardly take care of their own citizens isn't necessarily fit for purpose. And the humanitarian principles are, some might argue, increasingly problematic, or at least neutrality starts to feel like it when states bomb hospitals and ambulances in Syria, Ukraine, reportedly now in Gaza. At the very least, it can feel maybe unsatisfying when faced with outrageous actions and injustice. So with that, I think we have probably lots to talk about it. I'm going to jump in straight to our panelists. I'll be asking each of them one question to start with. They have about 3 minutes to respond, and then we'll just go from there. So Fiona, as someone who has questioned the principle of neutrality in the past, particularly when faced with genocide or grave human rights violations, but has since become a firm believer, could you maybe tell us if and why you believe the humanitarian principles are now fit for purpose, now and in the future?
Yes, I will try and do so. Thank you, Annie. It seems to be a very popular subject at the moment. It's certainly true that neutrality is very much under attack. So a few words just on my journey when I was working with Médecins Sans Frontières, and I was working in some of the really horrible places like with the genocide in Rwanda, in Somalia, in Liberia. I really felt at that time that neutrality was a bit of a cop-out, that it was a weakness, that it was putting on equal footing the aggressors and their victims. And then I started to work with ICRC, and I actually realised that I had misunderstood what neutrality is and the role that it plays, despite the fact that it's actually quite clear in the phrasing of the principle by John Pictet, which is that in order to keep the confidence of all, aid organisations don't take part in controversies. And I started to see for myself that remaining above the fray, not actually taking sides, was an operational posture. There's nothing morally good about being neutral. There's nothing moral about being neutral at all. It can be a cop-out. It can also, if states remain neutral, can be a way of guarding their commercial lines open to both sides of a conflict. But in the humanitarian sector, and especially for the ICRC, it is an operational posture, and it does open doors. It, of course, doesn't always work, which is obvious around the world today. But we are able to visit prisoners of war. How can you do that if you are clearly seen to be taking one side? We are able to repatriate the mortal remains of people on both sides of a conflict. We're able to negotiate, or to help, not so much negotiate, but be there as a neutral intermediary to facilitate the release of hostages, to facilitate the release of detainees. And this is really important. Red Cross messages across front lines, and of course humanitarian action across front lines. So it's always tempting because there is so much egregious action in the world today. There are, as Annie said, the bombing of hospitals. These things, we don't ignore them because we're neutral. We just raise these issues in bilateral confidential dialogue with the people who are concerned and who have perpetrated these. And so, I try to figure out myself, well, what's the opposite of being neutral? Can you honestly imagine for a global institution that we would pick and choose sides wherever we were working? And I think it's really important in this day and age with the decline of multilateralism. We are heading back to a time which was reminiscent of the Cold War period, although much worse with the social media and technology and everything else. But just in the position of states, think about the humanitarians, what they were doing in the Cold War period. They were pretty much relegated to the refugee camps on the outskirts of conflict. We were rarely going into conflicts. And, those refugee camps were very much politicised themselves because we considered, the humanitarian community considered that the refugee, and the states funding them, considered that refugees were voting with their feet. And so we already saw a massive polarisation. If you think of Honduras in particular, there were sort of right-wing refugees on one side of the country freeing the left-wing regime in Nicaragua, and on the other side of the country were left-wing refugees who were fleeing the right-wing dictatorship in El Salvador. And it was very interesting to see how the aid organisations themselves very much followed this ideological makeup. And I think we have a tendency to sympathise very much with the cause when we start to take sides. And then we can see that standards are not upheld. If you really look into the situation in the 80s, the sorts of dérives, the sorts of weird things that humanitarians were doing and excusing in the name of the greater political picture. So, for the propaganda purposes of some of the leaders in the camps, having malnourished children, deliberately malnourished, was good fodder for the cameras. And so they would do so. And of course, that's abhorrent for a humanitarian. But to try to speak out against that was really to go against the leadership in the camps. So I think we really need to absolutely think more about and look more at the history and see that there was a hugely politicised humanitarianism in the past, and what did it deliver, and really try to think about what does the future bring. Because for me, I really, really believe that for an organisation, particularly like the International Committee of the Red Cross, with a mandate under international law, that we have to remain neutral if we want to have dialogue with all parties to a conflict and try to carve out the humanitarian space that we need, despite the difficulties that we are facing.
Thanks, Fiona. Nikolaus, I think I'll turn to you as a journalist who I'm sure deals with questions of neutrality yourself, and speaking of camera fodder, as someone who I'm sure humanitarians would like to get the attention of. What does it take as we've said many times, there are multiple catastrophes around the globe. What does it take for one to get the attention of, let's say, the mainstream media or where you work?
Well, first of all, it's not a competition, although there are so many catastrophes around the world, and almost every day, every week, there's a new one. Let's just look back for 48 hours and see what's happening in the Gaza Strip and in Israel. So let me point out 3 different categories of catastrophe, if you may, very briefly. It's an earthquake or a tsunami. That gets our attention, that gets public attention. The closer it gets, geographically or emotionally. But that's real natural catastrophes. Secondly, any type of catastrophe which urgently needed help from humanitarian organizations related to climate change. So a flooding, a drought, whatever, a giant bushfire. This will have another type of attention. I personally tend to think more attention the more it gets connected publicly with climate change. Maybe, from my point of view, there's some sort of inflation of what is to be connected to climate change in terms of catastrophes. There is some sort of competition who gets it better connected, closer connected to that phenomenon, which is bringing up the whole world in discussions on how to prevent climate change. And thirdly, when we talk about wars and refugees and humanitarian aid for refugees coming out of civil wars, international wars, whatever, it will become more and more important, at least to European publics, to German public, how many refugees this will produce and how many of them will knock on the doors of European borders, coming over the Mediterranean Sea, coming instrumentalized via Eastern Europe, via Russia, Belarus, and Eastern Europe. So we tend to judge the importance of the potential attention for different types of catastrophes, alongside whether it's climate change or wars, climate change or potentially producing refugees in numbers that might overwhelm welfare systems in European countries. So a mere earthquake is interesting, to speak it cynically. Climate change is more interesting, refugees are the most. So that's, I think, the echelon we look at it.
Well, it's really interesting to hear such a clear perspective on media thinking. Michael, maybe we can step back a bit. You have spoken of a vicious cycle of dependency created by certain types of aid. How do you propose we change this looking forward to the future?
Yeah, thank you. This my own come from my own work, both as an academic, but also as someone who was born and grew up in Africa, and having experienced firsthand the positive and the other difficult impact of humanitarianism on people in Africa. First of all, I want to make this statement that humanitarianism is a wonderful thing, and they're doing good work. This is excellent work. It's better to have it, and I'm not criticizing humanitarianism because I have an alternative. It is wonderful, but what I'm trying to suggest is how can we make it better in such a way that can be more responsive? What I call a creative adaptation to emerging crises, emerging questions, and emerging difficult problems. And I propose what I call a competitive collaboration or collaborative competition. I don't want to be too academic about it, but the question I have is, sometimes humanitarianism, in an attempt to do good, and this from experiences, sometimes made it more difficult. Accessibility to justice becomes difficult. First is the normalization of conflict. Conflict becomes regularized. But also the aspect of, because I'm interested in education, I give one or two story example. My former professor in Zimbabwe, he left his job as a teacher to work for a humanitarian agency in Uganda because they pay more, of course, to humanitarian people than they pay teachers who teach philosophy or elementary school. If you go to many of these Eastern countries, many people leave, they go to university not to study philosophy, of course, no, or history or mathematics. They study social work, something that will give them job to work with humanitarian aid workers. So you say that the whole strategy, it become an industry upon industry. So if you want someone to teach mathematics, no, it's easy to go and learn social work. My own uncle told me, what are you studying history for? Go do this. This is where the money is. Because they will give you money, you make a lot of money and stuff like that. So that is another problem. See, an institution, cultural, becomes problem. So if you look to the future, oh my God, you see dependency becomes a normality. It becomes regularized, normalized as an institutional truth, cultural truth, political truth, and intentionalized, and myth becomes a reality. And that is one danger. That's one. And I struggle with that. That's number one. And then the other aspect is that sometimes they have big, beautiful questions. This one is one somebody tweets. This is also my research that, in Gulu or in Sokoto or wherever, they have no toilets. And everybody wants to bring toilets. So the question is, why can't we talk to each other? Why can't we negotiate? That's what I call competitive collaboration or collaborative competition. So you see that in one instance, everybody were sending money for toilet. But maybe they need school, they need something else. So, and here is a challenge. Humanitarianism is good, but we need to step back and ask, what is the question we should be asking at a particular political crisis? And what is the solution? So sometimes we have an excellent question, but we bring terrible solution. Sometimes we bring wonderful solution, but we ask the wrong questions. Sometimes wrong question, wrong solution. And therefore, I propose then, how do we find out a space for good questions and good solutions in a space of collaborative competition? In other words, not to regularize poverty, regularize crisis, professionalize humanitarianism. We need to step back. So you see, because first of all, we have all these 4x4s, Land Cruisers, all of. If you want to be human, be more human, then you work with them, you get opportunity, you get paid more than professors, of course. You get paid more than this. And then it's okay now to be, really show off, I work for a humanitarian agency. That is a problem. That is a problem.
Okay. I've actually seen that as a journalist. I work with a lot of freelancers across the Middle East, and I can't tell you how many people have stopped doing journalism to work for NGOs because, it just pays more money and it's a stable job. And I absolutely can't blame them. Fiona, maybe, as a person who's worked in the humanitarian system for a long time, perhaps you could speak to, I don't know, are there situations where we can, be honest with ourselves and say that humanitarian aid has maybe done more harm than good in terms of normalizing conflict, and how this maybe, I suspect this may play into the humanitarian principles again and impartiality.
Yes, I wrote a book which was published 21 years ago, which was all about the unintended negative consequences of humanitarian action, because I was heading up MSF in the Rwandan refugee camps when we decided that, in fact, the camps were being used as a recruitment ground, all the refugees in the camps were being controlled by the génocidaires, and it was the aid coming in, and only the aid, that was keeping them in this situation. So the whole of MSF, we had a very, very big debates about what to do, because all 5 MSF sections at the time were all working in around Rwanda and the camps. And we all had the same diagnosis, that this was an unacceptable situation. But MSF France decided to take the decision that unacceptable meant we won't accept it, and we left. And it was a huge debate in the humanitarian community, blood on the floor, very nasty. And that then was what spurred me on to go back and write a PhD thesis about where does the responsibility of humanitarians lie when we are unable to really influence what's going on. We had called for military intervention to separate the génocidaires and the ex-FAR, the army, from the bona fide refugees. UNHCR had tried to move the camps further from the border, but it remained that nothing was done. And then we have to pose the question then, what is the responsibility of the aid organisations? Because in the end, the camps were attacked by Paul Kagame's regime, which was predictable after the Cabello massacre in 1995. And, up to 200,000 people were chased into eastern Zaire and lost their lives. Now, the whole aid community was able to get on a plane and leave as this was happening. They had 20 litres of water per person per day given to the refugees. Vaccination booklets were full. Humanitarians have done a great job on all of the technical aspects of the camp. But if we don't think about the bigger picture, and I think this is even less today than it was in the 90s when we used to have these debates, if we don't think about the bigger picture of what are we contributing to, and we focus too much on the easy wins of the technical, and I'm afraid the slogans that we throw around in the aid community, do no harm. Well, it's not possible to do no harm. There are always winners and always losers of humanitarian action, and we need to take that into account. So I'm a little bit of a hashtagged out because I'm not a believer myself.
I'm with you.
In this minimization of an idea, which is just, let's throw it out there. Let's throw all these slogans out there. And I think it's obfuscating some of the real problems that we see. I was in Myanmar earlier this year, really helping the ICRC wrestle with the moral dilemmas we face working not in the camps, but really in Myanmar with the Rohingya. These people have been in enclosed camps for over 10 years with absolutely no rights to do anything. And, what responsibility do we have? And I think this is what the whole humanitarian community needs to think about. I think the Rohingya are one of the most difficult. They are off the limelight. How do we get them back in the limelight? How do we get some kind of progress made on this issue? I think it's really one of the most tragic and difficult issues we're facing in the humanitarian world today.
Well, speaking of the limelight, maybe, Nikolaus, you could comment. I mean, I think you mentioned that it's not a competition between crises, but I think we know that there's limited time on television, limited attention, I guess.
There is limited, when I said there should be no competition between catastrophes, I was trying to say there should be no competition between victims.
Indeed.
Because they are all human beings, and there should be no difference between the one and the other type of reason why they became victims. Having said that, there is competition about a limited space, a limited amount of attention, airtime, whatever you name it, pages in the paper, whatever. So, my impression is, in the near or far future, this will become more and more politicized. As Fiona said, somehow we are falling back into times and patterns of the Cold War time, where all African conflicts has been politicized alongside the East and Western conflict, communism towards capitalism, if you want. And we will see something like this again. And if you just see what's happening around Gaza and Israel, we will have that discussion about humanitarian aid from now on, along the bigger question, whom do we help by helping? So, if all the humanitarian aid and all the structural aid that have been poured into Gaza Strip and into the structures run by the Hamas government, if we will scrutinize what has the money bought in terms of help for individual people, and on the other hand side, in terms of stabilizing a structure run by Hamas for very different purposes.
Michael.
So this is, well, how we're going to, well, we have to take a second look on this type of help because it's, well, politicized by the change of the world now and by the mere facts on the ground.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to jump in here because it actually affects also to what's happening in Africa. I'm happy you mentioned it. There's no competition between victims because that's why people were a little bit in humanitarian, at least in academic circle, what happened in Kosovo and what happened in Rwanda, and the way they received the treatment, the Kosovo receiving a lot of attention in the news, and how much more they paid the refugees, as opposed to how much they paid the people in Rwanda. The kind of discrepancy and the moral discrepancy caused a lot of people were still talking about it up to today. So that's actually, I like that. Now, you know, when we talk about people throwing a lot of word, decolonization is not a fancy term, decolonize, and without actually trying to problematize it, and this is where it becomes necessary, but we need to rethink it. As a political scientist now, when I speak about decolonization, this is what I'm talking about, not about the people, but about, nobody talks about the institutions, the structures. So now, also with Africa, with Gaza, with Middle East, when I talk about decolonizing foreign aid, decolonizing humanitarianism, what do I mean? And this is what I mean now. I mean in terms of this kind of rudimentary empowerment, not the structures, because the structures doesn't have any, the structures is what the problem is. They will always reproduce the problem. So when you say you want to go and help Nigeria, whatever the case may be, let's get this fact. Humanitarians are working under impossible circumstances. They are working under tremendous, difficult circumstances. So we have to have empathy for them on that ground. However, the question is, the institutions that you are building, to what extent does it mediate possible resolution or does it problematize it? In my own research, these institutions don't do a lot of help. They actually make it worse. And so the question is shifting away from those structures that we have relied on because they're still alien to the people to actually say, okay, look, instead of coming to throw money at Nigeria or so whatever, the people who are going to do that, why don't I take 1, 2, 3, 4 people from Sokoto or from Rwanda, whatever, I bring them to Germany, I teach them how to make shoemaking. Okay, be a good shoemaker, I'll send you back. Because if you give money to the government, you give money to these people who are in charge, they're still going to use it to buy weapons and imprison their people in some places. And this has been my problem with both humanitarianism, also with foreign aid. Don't give money to the governments anymore. They're going to make them worse. They're going to make it difficult. It's going to become a cycle of violence.
I guess it leads to something.
Let me answer very briefly. Don't give aid to the government. Yeah, I personally tend to think so. I personally tend to think the same way. But still, how to manage help, humanitarian help, without the government in charge? I mean, even if it's evil or not evil. So practically, I'm not into that business. But practically, I think this is going to be very difficult to step by. To bypass the government and the whole structures they run. That's the problem in Gaza.
Fiona, did you want to jump in?
Okay. Well, I think, though, if we went around the governments, we'd be accused even more of a colonialist approach to not recognise the local authorities, elected authorities. So whilst I agree with you totally, we see terrible mismanagement and corruption, not just in Africa, everywhere. In Western countries, absolutely everywhere, in the humanitarian sector throughout. But I don't know that going around government or local authorities is going to be the answer to that.
Go for it.
Yeah, the thing is, I understand, because that's political rhetoric is different from the pragmatism on the ground. I'm a product of German education. Stiftung, Friedrich-Ebert and Stiftung Mercator educated me. I did my Doktorarbeit in Deutschland. So, with Henrik, summa cum laude, thanks to them. So, I'm product of this institution. They didn't take me from Nigeria, they took me from South Africa. I got educated, gave me the opportunities to do this. I'm one example. There are many other examples. If they gave the money to the government, when I was at Cambridge, the only people I was having in my classes were people from ministers' children, people from the governors, people who are all educated, who are the people who have access. They get you education and they continue domination. That's political rhetoric. But there's a difference when you have access to the people. So it can be done. People like me, there are many people who know that, yes, bypass the government because they're not helping. They just use whatever resources you have to maintain the same elite who have been in power for the past 50 years, either their children or their uncles, they have been the same thing. So yes, ask any non-political African, and they'll tell you, yes, bypass the government. The cheap rhetoric of colonialism is just a rhetoric of, it's a mask. It's cheap. If you throw it at Western audience, oh, they fear you're going to talk colonialism. It's a mask. It's not real, because substantively, we understand that it's just a way to push people away if you talk colonialism, or I don't want to be a colonialist. But they use that, and they appropriate it. That's the danger now, because what happened in Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, they appropriate these kind of languages, and they go to tell the people, see, you are being colonized again. You are being colonized again, and they use it now to what? Have legitimation without consent. They create a new legitimation without consent. So that is the challenge.
But I don't want to defend corrupt governments or systems and wherever around the world. But still, what about the concept of ownership? There was, well, I'm not into that business, but as far as I remember, ownership said, well, we have to work with the either elected or existing structures we find in that specific country to be helped. If you say, well, push them aside, go directly to the people, it's an entirely different concept, isn't it?
Well, Habermas' response, your German Habermas, talks about recognition worthiness, because I speak for my country, home state, Nigeria. Unfortunately, these are all colonial states. They have the same architects. They are states because they have monopoly of violence. The question is whether they have self-determination. I'm Pan-Africanist, but I know that most of these states, they are in power because they have monopoly of violence. The people understand that. So the question is whether it's legitimation, but is it a legitimation with consent? So when we talk about ownership, who owns the state? Is it the people, or is it a legitimation without consent? Because we say democracy, election, but it's easy to appropriate power and have that legitimation without the consent of the people. So if you go, tell me, if you go to Sokoto or Kaduna or Lusaka, nobody knows the difference if I'm Hausa or religious or Muslim or Igbo. Nobody cares. But the elite problematize it in order to maintain that kind of legitimation. If you go to Kano, the normal Muslims and Christians, they eat together, they play together. Nobody cares. But the politicians need that differentiation to maintain certain form of legitimation. So the question is whether whose ownership, who owns the state? When you say ownership in that sense, then you are putting a lot of power into that kind of fraud called legitimacy. They don't have recognition worthiness, if I may quote the German Habermas. They don't. So that's my challenge, yeah.
It's quite a challenge that you've given us. You know, reporting recently on the earthquakes in Morocco and Libya, of course, this issue has come up when Morocco didn't immediately want international aid. Libya had a slightly different situation, and there was you know, a lot of people in the international community saying, you know, we want to go in, and I think, I mean, personally, I think there's a legitimate argument to be made that if a country can handle it itself, that maybe a system that just wants to get in a little bit too much should step back. But it is, of course, difficult to bypass governments and often impossible and illegal. But even if we're not talking about directly funding governments, I think, you know, the question that always comes up is whether the fact that, you know, can aid really be based on need alone? Is that actually outdated, given that we know that donor money is coming from countries who are funding certain responses because of their own priorities? And they're not just funding responses as a whole. You guys all know how it works. They're funding specific programs. They're somewhat involved in how they're designed. I don't know, Fiona, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Annie. And I think, though it's not a new question, I think that the idea of impartiality has never really been fulfilled on a global scale.
Yeah.
It's aspirational. I think it serves a purpose, though, that when you're in country, to try to focus on who are the most marginalised and the most disempowered in this place and how can we access them. I think Somalia is one of the interesting countries where the notions of impartiality and clashes with the whole system of solidarity that is there on a clan basis. And what we have seen from consecutive famines in the early 1990s and then in early 2000s has been that, aid capture is a very real thing. And there are clans with a lot more power, and a lot of that power comes from their very powerful diaspora who is there and can send money in. And there has been a completely disproportionate amount of victims among the marginalised clans, among the Bantu and among the Rahanweyn that do not have this great big clan structure of solidarity. So, and clientelism is alive and well in Somalia because your first allegiance is to your clan. So it is very, very difficult to project this notion of impartiality and to say that, no, we actually have to help the Bantu and the minority clans because they are more vulnerable. It's really hard to get outside of that trap. And even for, I think, staff across Somalia, their allegiance is very much split between the organisation and its values and its principles and the pressures they face from their own clan. And their power really derives from what are they able to deliver in their clan. So all of these notions, even diversity and inclusion, really hard in Somalia, because if you want to diversify the staff in your office, but they're not from the major clan in the area, how is that going to go down? What are you going to be able to do in that area? So these are really complicated. 30 years we've been trying in Somalia and really, failing. I think that Somalia is a really good case where the humanitarian system needs to really rethink how it's working.
Did you want to jump in, Michael?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a very important point because this again plays to the idea of context. And I think I agree with you in the idea of that kind of neutrality and the idea of impartial ethics that comes with it. Because also the thing is that I'm not trying to be too academic here, but this misunderstanding between ethnicity and tribe, people first to recognize the power that the tribe has on the consciousness, on the political unconscious of the local people, which is more than any other outside signifier. Any other, not even the government has power when it comes to the tribe. When ethnicity becomes politicized, the tribe itself possesses more than anything else. So that even if the person in power doesn't have moral legitimation, once it's a person of my tribe, I will vote for him. I will recognize whatever he says works. And so this is the context in which the humanitarian agent comes and is confronted with this kind of complexities. How does he negotiate that? So I agree with you. I think the issue of neutrality is a problem. It is actually, it is a problem because we need to move away from that impartial ethics to recognize that, well, this is evil, this is bad. Evil is evil. We can't just say in the name of neutrality, oh, well, I need to be indifferent to this because I'm playing. Because at the end of the day, it legitimizes violence, legitimizes immorality. So I think, thank you for mentioning that. I agree with you on that. Thank you. Yeah.
But I'm afraid it's even more complicated because evil is not evil. Apparently, that's my problem all the day long. Let's just watch the war in Ukraine. Half of the southern globe doesn't accept the notion of this is evil and Russia is responsible for that war, whereas the northern part of the globe accepts fully and subscribes fully to the idea, well, this is an attack without any kind of reasoning of any right to do so, to attack another country. So if we call Vladimir Putin, we don't do it, but even if we call Vladimir Putin, this is an evil, half of the world would say, no, it's not. So how do you cope as humanitarian actors with that the perception, the analysis of conflicts and tend to differ so much around the globe? And who's the one to judge, well, okay, this is really evil, so we won't help them, or we will help them in the second rank, not in the first one.
Yeah, I mean, for me, just it seemed that Ukraine really changed a lot of discourse in the media as well, where it seemed like journalists were clearly taking a side. It's obviously not for the first time, but using language that I found really shocking, that I'm sure many of you were used to, saying, oh, these people look like us, as opposed to Syrian refugees who apparently don't. But also in terms of in the aid sector, I know that this has thrown up a lot of questions around neutrality and also, and whether that means you can express an opinion in your organization. I'm sure many of you work in organizations that have rules about what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. Of course,
Nikolaus, because this is a very important point to raise, because I think the distinction here, because I think I see the tension, is because we always subscribe to official discourses. What is official discourses? But politics is not about morality. It never is about power. Morality is an agenda of politics. So politics, but the question is that we fuse politics with morality. So when politicians speak, we expect politicians to be moral, but they're not supposed to be moral. It's about power. So whatever they say is about getting power and keeping the people restive. Morality becomes only an agenda of politicians. And so maybe that's what I'm suggesting, that maybe if we begin to change our mindset, what is an official discourse? What do politicians say as official discourse? And then what is the moral question we should be debating? And so when we separate political discourse, which is official, from what is actually the moral agenda, what crisis is at stake, we make that distinction, then we can have a debate that can be globalized at the same time, localized at the same time. So if we don't fuse morality and politics, because politicians are not supposed to be moral, they're supposed to be just about power. We expect them to be moral, but they don't care really. Only when they get power, they decide. When they get power, then they decide what is moral for them. And so that's why I think the question again of neutrality becomes important for me. If we make that distinction, then morality becomes unmasked from political violence that is imposed upon it, which makes it difficult for us.
I'd like, before I turn, if there are questions, I'd like to ask Nikolaus something that I think about a lot. He knows I think about a lot, which is how the words we use in the media and the images that we show, and this applies to the aid sector as well, I should say. I think a lot of images are used in service of awareness that sometimes people have had to apologize for, or, sort of the cliche pictures of starving babies. That I'm not sure this is necessarily a net positive, but I'm wondering, in the media, if there are any phrases, photos, images that you either avoid using or do use because they play into certain discourses about, for example, refugees in Europe.
Well, when it comes to photos, I think you would choose the most emotional ones. And this might be the famous, and we all know them, baby who's starving with great eyes and whatever you want. It's still, children suffering is a very strong emotion, either refugees or famine or whatever. But still, from a journalistic point of view, we would try to tell the story by telling an individual story. So if we go alongside with somebody who's suffering through that camp, through the catastrophe, tell the very one story representing all the stories, hopefully. I think this is a very old-fashioned way to do it, but it's still the most powerful way to do it.
Thanks.
May I just come in on that one? Because I'm involved in a project, a research project, looking at the ethics of visuals in the humanitarian sector, because there has been this awareness that we don't want to only show the really stark negative images and want to show more empowering ones. But it's interesting because I can see both sides to this, because sometimes we've gone too far the other way. The pendulum has swung so that positive images of people can be shown that actually hides the suffering that they are undergoing, and it makes it look like everything's okay. And so I think that we have to really avoid falling into that trap. And so it's really interesting what you say. Where can we find this common ground that will appeal to people so that they will have compassion and donate money to aid organisations, but also show the dignity of the victims?
Well, this is to be judged on a day-to-day basis, I think, in every type of editorial staff you're working with. And the red line for most of German publishers, I guess, at least for them, for those publishers I've been working for, and that have been very different publishers, is we don't show nobody dying. So, be it a child, be it an adult. I think we tend, if my observation is right, German media would rather blur more pictures than it did before in the past. We would show dead people, corpses, only if they are anonymous, if you want, and non-attributable.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's something I come up upon all the time, and something that we also discuss about, if we treat pictures of people, on, let's say, what is probably the worst day of their lives, the same as we do in every country. I think that's also extremely important to consider how we picture people from everywhere in the world, because I don't think it's always the same, and of course comes from our own biases and where we come from. Are there any questions from the audience? I'm sure we could probably keep speaking for a long time. Okay, a mic is coming to you because your hand was up first.
Hi, my question is, so of course, I think a lot of us find it's important to have venues like this to talk, and we have intersections of discourse. But my question is around do you have any advice for how to navigate avoiding being prescriptivist? So like you can say you're an expert in journalism or humanitarianism, but it's when we go out and do our thing after this Congress, how do we navigate not prescribing what we think is structural knowledge and being avoiding being like this new colonial instrument for what we think is right, what we think the humanitarian principles are, and that's the question for the three of you, basically.
Okay. Michael, you want to take that one?
Yes, because I think you're pointing about possession, exploitation, domination. I mean, these are my own principles, because that is the prescriptive aspect leads to possession, exploitation, domination, PED. And you're right to say that prescriptive ethics can be problematic. So how do we navigate that? My own work, I try to say, okay, in closer Zulu, we say umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. That is Ubuntu. A person is a person to other people, recognizing the other person in their context of experience and history. How do we speak to that? The context is there. The context of horror, conflict, whatever the case may be, is already there. So on the one hand is this. Do we just come from outside, our own notion of morality, our own notion of justice, our notion of what is good? So you say, well, people are poor in South Sudan because they have no iPhone. No, iPhone is not the standard of being poor in South Sudan. There are other elements of being poor that is not. Because they are poor because they don't have a flat, whatever, door. They don't have, no, that's not the standard for being poor. The question is, how do you come with your own idea of justice and morality and try to make it speak to the context of experience? One, understand the context. Two, well, of course, I don't say you don't come with an idea. Let your idea of morality speak to the context. So you see, the context speaks to the people, but also making sure that the agent who is there is mediated. So you'll be willing to be transformed both by the context, looking at it in a way that's, okay, judged to be good, but also not dismissing whatever you have. So I'm not saying that whatever you have as notion of good should be dismissed, but letting those ideas negotiate each other in a way that can be meaningful and transformative for the people who are living that experience.
Thanks, Michael. We've got a question up here. He has his hand up really fast, so I'm going by speed.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much. This is Günther from Munich. I would like to ask both the media but also the humanitarian area in how far we are actually talking about a complete market failure. And how would you think about approaches in order to address this market failure? Because what are we talking about? We are talking about a driving factor for the media, that is the public attention, clicks, people switching on the television. And for the humanitarian sector, it's about donation and money that comes in. And in the end, what we see as a result is a complete market failure, because the attention doesn't go where it should go and the humanitarian aid doesn't go where it should go, whereas both of them are addressing very basic humanitarian rights, which is the right for information about the situation, and the second one is for basic survival.
All right. Yeah,
I don't think that the market picture is the right one. If it's a market failure, people would turn off the television, but they don't. And it's a choice, right? We have to choose, alongside with numerous other medias and numerous other social media platforms, on what do I put my resources today? Do I send another 4 reporters to Gaza, or do I leave them in Ukraine? That was my question today. This is a choice, and I go along with that choice by judging, by doing some sort of prognosis, what will be the most important story for the people to know I'm sending for, I'm doing my program for. And so I don't agree to the notion this is the wrong way to proceed, because somebody else would know better who I should send my reporters to and what topic I should cover. Who should that be? Who's supposed to judge that in my place? I have to do it myself.
And for the humanitarian side, I'm not sure either. Market failure, perhaps on donations of individuals, yes, perhaps. But you know, the ICRC is funded mostly by states, and it's very interesting to see that states are diminishing for all across the sector the money that they are allocating to humanitarian action, because they are very much more concerned with things at home, the post-COVID pandemic. Armaments are being sent massively to Ukraine. There is a lot of competing, and it's just interesting to see. This is why I really think about the Cold War period and coming back again, to see the retraction of humanitarianism. I used to get up on stages and say there was never a golden era of humanitarian action, but yes, there was. And I was fortunate enough to be part of it. I started in 1991, end of the Berlin, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was this post-Cold War optimism, Boutros Ghali's agenda for peace. We were not going to worry about state sovereignty anymore. There was responsibility to protect. All of these fantastic notions of the humanitarian sector. We were the heroes, even if we reluctantly, but we were out there doing really important stuff. And today, access is being reduced, funding is being reduced. So I'm not very optimistic about the future of humanitarian action, but I think we can't, put our arms down. We have to really fight for this being absolutely crucial, and not just, as you said, to stop the refugees coming to Europe. No, on the basis of our common humanity. And to an earlier point, every state in the world has signed the Geneva Conventions. So there is a common basis of what we believe is what we should uphold as a basis in humanity. And I think a lot of our, the ways we have to translate this, and a lot of our work, we find similar notions about respect for humanity, the laws of wars in every country in the world. And we need to keep talking about these, because we need to absolutely uphold this notion that we are all human beings and that we share this common humanity, and it's worth preserving.
Okay, I think we have time for one question if it's super quick. Who has a super quick question? Right there.
Hello, thank you so much. I would like just to follow up quickly on Nikolaus' comment regarding Ukraine. I've seen that, and going back to the question of humanitarian principles, I think that there have been several articles. I can't give one now right top of my head, but mentioning that the war in Ukraine it really represents somehow a shift in the way how the world and humanitarian actors kind of apply the humanitarian principle in their action, and that in many other crises we have struggled being neutral, impartial, but so how we felt very uncomfortable with that and did not want to kind of say it out loud, and that somehow the Ukraine war like kind of put it out there, and somehow that many more actors, especially from the Western world, kind of don't feel that there is a need to be or to pretend being neutral and impartial, and somehow started putting like the discourses that we've heard and the way that the response and aid is provided somehow just put the humanitarian principle aside and somehow said, well, that's okay, we don't need to be neutral anymore. So do you think there is really a shift, and how does it challenge or maybe, creates a...
You've got 1 minute to answer that question. No pressure.
I couldn't judge whether there's a major shift for all the humanitarian system ignited by the conflict in Ukraine. But on the other hand side, what I clearly see, different from other political views on it, what I see is this is a very clear-cut conflict. There's one aggressor and one side is defending itself by any means. And this is why I tend to think we should help them. We should help the Ukrainian people to defend themselves. So this is a very clear-cut thing. I couldn't judge whether this goes for all African conflicts, Asian conflicts too, but this one, so close to us geographically, is a clear-cut one. And yes, it's very difficult to be neutral in that conflict. I couldn't.
Thanks. I'm sorry that we have to wrap up. Thank you so much to all the panelists. We have to close. The next session is at 1:30 on neglected, forgotten, historic. What good do crises categorizations do? And Fiona, if you want to talk, you have 1 minute.
I just want to say that, look at Afghanistan. The ICRC managed throughout the years when the Taliban were in opposition to work on both sides of the conflict. We didn't take sides. We didn't, like a lot of aid organisations, threw their lot in with NATO, and they were not able to go to Taliban-controlled areas. But in Afghanistan, we did, and look, today, the Taliban is the government in power. We're able to work there. So really, we just don't focus only on Ukraine. There are other countries around the world that we need to think about, and consistency in our approach is important.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for giving your attention to this panel.